All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Actually, Becky, how about you introduce yourself and give a tiny spiel on EBRC first, and then we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves.
Sure, sounds good. So EBRC is the Engineering Biology Research Consortium. We exist to advance the field of engineering biology to meet global and national needs. We do that. Our organization is a small group of staff, but we bring together students and postdocs. We bring together faculty, members at universities, with government people, with industry leaders to identify what are the challenges that the field has to overcome. What are the ways that this field can best meet the challenges that we face today in food and agriculture, in environmental conservation, in moving away from fossil fuels for synthesizing products and towards bio-based products. And so EBRC, our function is to kind of bring all these great minds together and help the field move forward. And one of the most exciting and awesome parts of that job for me is working with our Student and Postdoc Association, many members of which are, I think we've got 8 or 9 of you Student and Postdoc Association members on the call. The total group is about 250 people. And it's a great group of people interested in recognizing that there are a lot of great minds, like all of yours on the call, who are not yet engineering biologists, but may be interested in the field and figuring out what this means, what's synthetic biology, and is it a path that you want to follow? So they've developed panels and workshops and mentorship programs and things like that to try to make sure that people who are interested in the field have opportunities to ask questions and find out more about it and are connected to opportunities. And so with that, super excited to see all of you on the call today. And thank you so much to all the SPA organizers for developing this. And Ross, back to you.
Great. So I'll go ahead and start off by introducing myself. My name is Ross. I'm from near Seattle, Washington. I did my undergrad degree at the University of Washington, so go Dogs. I did my PhD at MIT in Ron Weiss's group, so mammalian synthetic biology, kind of focusing on making control systems for gene expression. And now I'm at Peter Zandstra's group at the University of British Columbia doing a postdoc. And we are working on producing T cells from pluripotent stem cells for sort of next generation cell therapies. So in terms, each of our panelists will say kind of what engineering biology means to them. And I guess to me, I just really like the idea of being able to control what cells do. But obviously engineering biology is much more than just individual cells. But if I could make a few T cells, I'm a happy guy. I'll pass it over to Andrea.
Great, thanks, Ross. So hi, everybody. My name's Andrea Garza. I am currently in the Chapel Lab at Rice University, but for my undergrad, I went to the University of Houston and majored in biomedical sciences. I actually didn't do any research up until grad school, aside from one brief summer research program. And so this is all, or at the beginning, this was all very new to me. I'm currently studying bacteria and genetic engineering tools in bacteria, so more on the CRISPR engineering side of things. And as far as what engineering biology means to me, or why I'm interested in it, is mostly because it just seems really cool to be able to just kind of dig into the science and understand why things are happening, but then be able to like manipulate them. So instead of just kind of being like, oh, I know a cell behaves this way because of this reason, then you can say, well, now that I know that, I can change the way it's behaving to do something cooler. So yeah, I guess I'll pass it on to Megan.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. I am from Connecticut, and I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Rhode Island. I got my bachelor's in chemical engineering, and I actually never even took a biology class while I was there. The only biology like formal education I had was from like freshman year of high school. So engineering biology was certainly not something that I knew I wanted to do. I am currently a 5th year PhD student in the Styczynski lab at Georgia Tech, where I now do cell-free synthetic biology with point of care diagnostic applications. So I guess what engineering biology means to me, without being too profound, I guess I'll just say like what I like about it. I really like, especially coming from a chemical engineering background, how many fundamental disciplines kind of go into synthetic biology and engineering biology in general. So I'm definitely the kind of person that takes a lot of interest and passion in a lot of different fields. So it's really cool to see kind of the synergy of all of my background knowledge coming together and taking that to take things that exist in nature and reprogram them to do super cool and super useful things. So with that, I guess I'll pass it on to Kelsey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kelsey. I did my undergrad at Columbia University, where I did research in Dr. Taldino's lab. I'm currently at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, in my 3rd year of my PhD, where I engineer fungi to basically make living biomaterials. And to me, what engineering biology means is just programming biology, similar to the way we program software, but with living things and creating life. And I think that's really cool, how we can manipulate the natural processes and use them to solve environmental challenges and other challenges that we experience. And with that, I'll pass it on to Ice.
Hi, everyone. Ice is my nickname, but my real name is hard to pronounce. So I go by Ice instead. I'm originally from Thailand. I did my undergrad in chemistry back in Thailand. It's at Mahidol University. I go further for master in organic chemistry, also in Thailand. After I graduate, I worked for a year in a biochemistry lab because I feel like you can do something else apart from what is in the glassware as well. Let's just grow something in another kind of glassware. So I shifted to biochemistry and then like come to the US to study at University of Washington in a program called molecular engineering, which is kind of like pretty multidisciplinary program. I was jointly advised by James Curtis and JC Salatin. They are from chemical engineering and chemistry. And I'm working on bacterial synthetic biology, also some bacterial CRISPR stuff, and turning 5th year now. I think engineering biology for me, since I'm from sort of like pretty heavy chemical synthesis background, I really like how engineering biology can repurpose the living being itself to do whatever we want it to do. Like, for example, I really like the field of metabolic engineering, where we repurpose the metabolism that is already there to do something else that, you know, the cells can be capable of, that, or something that they will not do it by itself. But for us, an engineer, we can sort of like redirect that process to do the desired trait or whatever. I'll pass it to Christina.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Davis. I first got involved with engineering biology in 2017 when I joined an iGEM team actually for my high school. From there, I went on to get my undergrad at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, where I focused on biochemistry and molecular biology. At that same time, I did all through undergrad, I was a research assistant in a government lab, focusing on augmenting human performance. And then right after undergrad, I joined Scripps Research, where I'm now a 2nd year in the Ben Shen lab, focusing on utilizing synthetic biology for natural product discovery. So now I'm in a chemistry department. And so what I'm fascinated about with engineering biology is I just think as we continue to develop all these methodologies and the tunability of all these biological systems, this is what's really going to allow us to create rapid solutions for current issues and future issues. So yeah, that's me. And then I'll pass it on to Leah.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Leah. My undergraduate is at Penn State University. I graduated with energy engineering. So I am currently a graduate student. My graduate research started at Rowan University, which is in South Jersey. And so I was doing mammalian cell-based engineering, focusing on cancer immunoengineering, so targeting our immune cells to kill cancer. However, that being one aspect of engineering, and that was in biomedical engineering, actually. Similar to Meg, my undergrad, I had no bio, so I learned about engineering biology in grad school. And I wanted to learn more of the basic science, so I'm currently on an academic internship, so to speak, at the University of Pennsylvania, helping a neurosurgeon open her lab. So learning about glioblastoma to then be able to apply to immune engineering. So what engineering biologies mean to me, there's two things. So one, also similar to Meg, it bridges all my interests. So it bridges my energy engineering undergrad. So my energy and renewable focus with also my love for immune engineering cancer focus. But it's also really means to me how creative I can be. So that was one of the main things that really drew it to me, is that I could be creative and I can think of everything as a potential part and have like unlimited ways to solve a problem. So those are the two main reasons that I loved it. And then last, I think, is Neil.
Yep. So hi, everyone. I'm Neil Butler. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and I also went to Penn State for undergrad. There I studied chemical engineering. So our program had a pretty heavy engineering biology focus, which kind of led me into wanting to pursue that in grad school and things like that. So I went into my PhD right after undergrad, and I started at the University of Delaware. I'm currently in the Kundapur lab, and there I'm working on metabolic engineering of prokaryotes as it pertains to like an expanded genetic code and trying to get prokaryotes to autonomously use an expanded genetic code. So that's my primary research, and what engineering biology means to me, I guess, is like two different things. One thing is like I enjoy the capabilities of the cell, how like fascinating it is how many different reactions are going on and how you can manipulate those different reactions to make this plethora of different products and take one system and make so many different or perform so many different applications. And the programmability of the cell is super interesting to me as well. And on the other end, I just think it's a nascent field. So there's just so much potential in the field at this point, as compared to like a lot of the other potential paths I could have gone into as a chemical engineer. So that's kind of what drew me to engineering biology from undergrad into grad school.
Great. All right, so let's get into some of our questions then. So the first thing that we'd like to talk about a little bit is career opportunities in the field, and sort of how or why doing a master's or PhD to study engineering biology is useful in general, and then also how that can sort of get you to different stages in industry or in academia. So does anybody want to take this on to start?
Sure.
Go for it, Cassie.
So question was, should you repeat the question? Why do we pursue a PhD or master's? Or
let's talk about first in like the perspective of career opportunities. So what are the career opportunities, and then why do like a master's or PhD with respect to careers?
Okay, so one thing I really admire about the field of engineering biology, the opportunities are truly endless, right? Originally, when I was first introduced to engineering biology or synthetic biology, my goal was VC, venture capitalism, right? I wanted to be out in California or in Boston, help developing companies, biotech companies that utilize technology to build things. Eventually, I was introduced to the world of policy and research and patent law and all these other fascinating fields, think tanks where people just pay you to be smart and think and know about the field, which is nuts. And I was really fascinated by all those opportunities. And like I said, originally I wanted to do VC, and I was going to do an MBA, MS, and I'm doing a PhD because my PhD advisor, not my PhD advisor, the PhD student I was working under, Tetsu, he told me I wasn't going to do that. He told me to get a PhD, and I trusted him. And then Dr. Zanino echoed the same thing. I trusted them both. I did it. And that gives me the freedom to do a lot of these different things. And that's why I pursued a PhD immediately after my undergrad.
Leah?
Yeah, so I'm actually writing a white paper with 2 other students currently in EBRC, and we're learning how much that the bioeconomy is just huge at all levels. So like if you, in mostly we've talked to a few companies and they've just talked about hands-on skills. So if you have a lot hands-on skills and you would like to go into like industry right away, you might be able to, but like if you want to go into industry, it just kind of depends on the skills like you want to grow or in academia. So like if you want to gain some hands-on research skills to go right into bioeconomy, then you could choose a master's and not do like a huge project. But then like PhD wise, if you want that bigger thing of knowledge, a bigger in-depth kind of understanding how to create a project and how to think through one and maybe stay in academia or like a higher level scientist, then PhD is a great way to go. I think if you want to try things out master's wise to see if you would like to continue, you can always do that and then go on. There's like a mix of people who have a master's when they're going for PhD and then people who don't. So you can kind of choose whichever one, but just know there's a huge bioeconomy out from what I've been learning.
Andrea?
Yeah, so I guess to give a bit of my perspective, I'll just start with kind of the way I perceive or the different kinds of career paths, because it's a bit of what Kelsey and Leah have said, that it is kind of endless, but we kind of like to categorize the potential post science or post STEM careers into a few boxes. And so one of them is academia, and generally we tend that to mean that you're going to go on to become a professor or a PI or some sort of thing where you're kind of still like in school or within, you know, the academics. Then we have the other side, which we just kind of generally call industry, which is kind of just like a Pandora's box of a bunch of different types of career paths. And that just means non-academia for the most part for a lot of people. Sometimes within that, you also break it down a little bit into government, which is also kind of like a very vague and nebulous category. And then policy, which is also a very vague and nebulous category. But with government, as kind of the name implies, you're working with some kind of government entity or some kind of like government lab. That just means, I mean, generally for a lot of us, it means working under the like the NIH or the, I forget the other names, but you know, some sort of like acronym letter thing that's related to whatever government of whatever country you're currently residing in. And then as far as policy, that one is a little bit less sciencey. That one has more to do with you're helping make laws, or you're helping give your opinion, because a lot of the technologies are very novel, and so there aren't necessarily a lot of laws to govern what should and shouldn't be considered okay or like ethical. And so sometimes they need people who are experts in the field to give their opinion and say, well, I know, for example, I know that this kind of DNA synthesis might be kind of dangerous. We should think about what kind of laws we want to develop to prevent anybody from using it in a harmful way. And so those are kind of the big box categories that you have. But then as far as how just having your undergraduate degree or a master's degree or a PhD degree, how they kind of fit into those, the answer is they all kind of have their different levels of how much it matters, in a sense, whether you have different kinds of titles. In industry, for example, there's some occasions where having a master's gets you a better pay grade, and then having a PhD gets you even more. But thankfully, that's not the norm anymore. Thankfully, now they're kind of, some companies are kind of going more towards, if you can do the job or if you have the skill set, then you're going to be paid accordingly, which is great for the field, in my opinion. For academia, it is kind of a heavy requirement that you have a master's or a PhD in order for you to become a professor, just because that's kind of been the norm for a while, and it's very difficult to get out from there depending on what level of education you want to teach. But aside from that, it's just, it's very specific. But even if you don't decide to go, you know, past the undergrad or past the master's stage, you can still have a lot of opportunities. And so it's a little bit more of like figuring out what kinds of jobs you want to do, or kind of like what other people in the field have done in terms of getting masters or getting a PhD, and seeing what is right for you. Because you don't necessarily have to have a PhD for the job you want, unless it's kind of a standard. Yeah.
Great. I think I'll just add one more thing here, is that when you do, or at least to me, when you do a PhD, it's not just about the skills that you gain in terms of the kinds of techniques you learn and things like that, but it's also that you're gaining skill as somebody that can lead a project, that can train other people. And so when you're brought into, let's say, an industry position thereafter, you have opportunities to go into management and sort of leading teams and building projects out, that is sort of going to be easier for you to pitch as a candidate compared to somebody that has less experience. Although certainly industry folks for filling such positions will also look at people that have been in industry for a long time and might not have a PhD. And so that would sort of depend on what experience you've had in industry, and how much sort of leadership or project development sort of experiences that you've been able to have there as well. So there's a lot of soft skills and a lot of hard skills that go together, and that you'll learn when you do a master's and PhD both. And the PhD is just kind of like a deeper, longer version of that. Cool. So a question we get asked a lot, and you may have noticed a lot of us are not necessarily even in bioengineering programs right now, and didn't necessarily do bioengineering programs in the past, is do you have to have done this sort of exact type of undergraduate before you go and try to do this research in grad school? The short answer is no. Synthetic biology needs people from all over, and there's diverse skill sets, and you'll never know everything you need to know to get started. But if anybody wants to chime in here with sort of their experience coming from maybe not engineering, or maybe not from biology, then we can expound on this a little bit. I'm a bad person to ask because I did bioengineering in undergrad.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick because I'm in like organic chemistry, so it's not too far. Like considering like what I want to come to grad school in doing metabolic engineering, which is another kind of chemical synthesis, it's not too far. But like if you take a look at a program or what was described in your transcript or like in your background, it's not that close to what synthetic biologists, like mainstream synthetic biologists, has been doing. So there's a little bit of, I would say there's a little bit of hiccup that like you have to express of like that, you know what engineering biology is at least, and you have like interest in this kind of thing that you want to do for your PhD. At least like people are gonna, you know, they don't really want you to, you know, come in the middle of nowhere to do something that you don't really know what you're supposed to do. So changing the field is fine, but like you need to know what you want to do. That's sort of like my like very first criteria. Like I did spend some time trying to figure out what I really want to do in my PhD, because I sort of like changed the subject a little bit. So I'm sort of like, you don't really have to join the PhD right away if you're not like, you know, committed to do it, because 5 years is a decent amount of time. So if you're, you know, want to take a gap year, spending like a year or so trying to like work, or like trying to do a master to find a path that is proper for you, that's also, you know, a choice. There are lots of people who did that, who like take master first just to make sure that you really want to do this, or like work in something that is more relevant before coming to the PhD. So that's sort of like what I want to, you know, jump in terms of like changing the field, or like what kind of like prior background you need. But like one important thing about majors or about the program is that like you should get connected to the team that you want to work with as well, whether like they have like preference or criteria about like what kind of teammate you want to like they want into their team. There are some like bureaucratic thing that like they cannot accept student from another program because their program is like fixated onto like accepting only student from their program, PhD program, something like that as well. So like getting connected with the team you want to join with is a very is a very important step. in joining the PhD career. Hey, Megan.
Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to chime in because I like mentioned earlier that, I never actually taken like a formal biology class in my undergrad. But I believe Neil said he also did his bachelor's in chemical engineering, and he had kind of a different experience. And so at my university with chemical engineering, they actually let you choose paths to kind of focus in, because chemical engineering can be super broad. And even though I had a pharmaceutical and a biology track available to me, I, at 18 years old, still decided to do the traditional chemical engineering track. And looking back at it now, after I've been doing engineering biology for 4 years, I don't regret not choosing the biology or the pharmaceutical path of chemical engineering, because staying in the traditional path allowed me to take courses like I did an extra semester of organic chemistry. I did a full year of physical chemistry, which my colleagues that were in the biology focused track, they didn't get the chance to take. And those ended up being some of my favorite classes. And, that knowledge helped me with my PhD courses and my PhD work. So I definitely don't regret not choosing to take more biology, because when I was a freshman in college, I didn't know that that's what I wanted to do, truly. And I don't regret it, because when, you join a PhD program, at that point, like, you're really good at learning. So at that point, I had decided what I wanted to do, and I was choosing labs that were doing synthetic biology. And I was able to quickly learn everything that I wanted to learn. It was super interesting to me. I immediately became very passionate about it. And you join a lab that hopefully is also super supportive and helps you get where you need to go. So I think having a non-traditional background, non-traditional research experience could really help you, as long as you have the motivation and the passion to, bridge the gaps that you're kind of missing in your formal education. I don't think there's anything that's holding you back. So I just kind of wanted to share my 2 cents on that and say that, like, I didn't know I wanted to do this until I started doing it. And I don't have any regrets with how I ended up here. So as long as you just have a lot of interest, passion, and motivation, you can get where you need to go. Leah?
Yeah, I want to add on to that because I didn't have any bio undergrad as well. And so I don't regret that either. And Becky kind of mentioned in the beginning how there's like the climate roadmap coming out. And so engineering biology, and then like how I did energy engineering, that's a whole discipline and field in itself. So it's very cool because engineering biology is so interdisciplinary, which is why I've loved it. So I've changed. I actually worked a year after undergrad in construction, and we were building labs. And so my interest shifted over to more of the medical side. So I ended up applying for graduate programs with that. And then my PI convinced me of SynBio. And then I dug deeper and I'm like, oh my gosh, this can connect everything I've ever learned. So you can be on many different paths and you'll find where you want to go, or you'll just see that everything can intertwine together. So it's very cool.
Awesome, thanks guys. So when you guys were looking at graduate school and graduate programs, how did you decide where to apply? What were you looking for in programs and in labs? Who wants to go first? Kelsey.
So for me, the things that mattered were was the research project. That first thing was the research project, something I was passionate about, right? So I sent out a bunch of emails to all professors by going through their research labs, reading their papers, seeing who did stuff with sustainability, synthetic biology, who did not. Next, I focused my search on where the school was located, right? I was kind of drawn to government stuff. So I was looking in the DMV area, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. Cost of living was also a thing. I was tired of living in New York City and paying those high prices. And I knew that, PhD students don't make a lot of money. So depending on where you go. So I wanted someplace at a cheaper cost of living. So I used this website called mit.livingwage.edu to find the approximate cost of living and kind of compare that ratio of stipend to living wage. That was a big determinant. Those were like the three things that I kind of focused on. Yeah, and where also where I want to live at, like where I think I'll be happy. So those 4 things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of follows what Kelsey just ended with, which is like in your PhD, you're going to be spending anywhere from 4 to 6, 7, 8 years at whatever city you end up with. I mean, maybe not the entire time, but for the most part, and also living in that area with those people, interacting with your lab mates. And so I think a lot of emphasis is placed on the research project and on your mentor and things like that, which are definitely very important. But I think one thing that a lot of people forget is to also kind of look at the environment of the school, figure out if you're very interested in sports, what the sports culture is like at whatever university or institution you're at. If you're interested in hiking, then figure out, are there going to be any mountains? So all of those kinds of like little tiny details that nobody kind of points out, but just look for those tiny details because you're going to be spending your life here the next few years. And so of course you want to be happy. You want to have not only the work side of things, but also the life side of things.
So when I was looking at PhD programs, I had a bioengineering background research experience wise. And so I knew that's what I wanted to do. But when I was looking at programs, I really wanted to be in an interdisciplinary program. So I wanted to be able, to have rotations in multiple labs and also to be able to rotate in multiple departments. I didn't want to only be able to rotate in the 4 professors at this specific department. I wanted to be able to, if I wanted to rotate in the chemistry department, I could. And so that was really important to me when looking at grad schools and where to apply. And then once you start getting interviews, what I was really stood out to me for my current PI is just the passion he had when he talked about his science and how that passion can also become really inspiring and how that's important as you continue on in your PhD.
Neil?
Yeah, so I guess from my perspective, when I was looking at different programs to go into, I had a chemical engineering background that had engineering biology as somewhat of a focus of the program. So there's a decent amount of faculty within the program you can reach out to when you're looking at different grad schools. And if you say, hey, I'm looking to research in this area or that area, they'll probably have some input on like what universities would have like programs that do that type of engineering biology that you're interested in. And if you have older graduate students in your group who also apply to grad school, they're also good resources to rely on and reach out to as well. And then when you're actually taking a research lab and things like that, I think the research is very important and you should make sure that there's a good fit there. But I think what's more important is that you pick a boss that you mesh well with almost, because you're going to have to work with this person for 5 years. And most of the time it's very difficult to like break that up. And I mean, you can do it, but it's a very difficult process. You want to be very deliberate, make sure that that person is a good fit for you, your work style, and your like academic interests generally. But just my 2 cents.
All right, awesome. I think I'll reiterate one thing for me that was important. So I was interested in systems biology, neuroengineering, and synthetic biology, and I generally recommend to people to find a place where there's many opportunities for you to succeed, and you're not kind of locking yourself into one particular lab at a school. Now, some programs, not many, you kind of can get directly admitted into a lab, but a lot of them have some kind of rotation structure. And so definitely take advantage of that. Check out your different interests, see what you like, and see what the lab culture is like once you're there. This is like more for the future, like once you're actually at the institutes that you're interested in, but your sort of lab culture is what's going to help get you through your PhD, which is a long and arduous process. So it's important to like your boss, and it's also important to like your lab mates and get along with them, and be in a supportive environment. You can maybe start to get a feel for that if you reach out to professors. Sometimes they'll put you in touch with a senior grad student or postdoc in their lab. And so you might be able to actually connect with somebody over Zoom, from labs that you're interested in right now, or once you're getting closer to applications if you're a younger student. So take advantage with Zoom being so prevalent now. It's a lot easier than it used to be able to connect with future labs. Cool. So let's talk about when we put together our applications, what our sort of approach was to doing that. Because I think a lot of people might have different strategies for how they decided how they're going to put together their application materials and then actually submit them to different departments. So do we have any takers on this one? Maybe I'll just put a word out for spreadsheets in general. It can be very useful for organizing what the different programs are, what the labs are there, what they do. You can rank them by your interests. This going back to what I said about finding places with a lot of schools that you're interested in. This helped me to kind of say, okay, well, these are based on the number of labs that I'm interested in. You know, maybe these are my top X number of schools. Andrea.
Yeah, I second the spreadsheet thing. I think also one of like the harder things to do is all of the personal statements that you have to keep track of and make sure they're personal, but at the same time, but you don't want to be writing, you know, a new personal statement for every single school, but it still has to be specific, and it's quite a nightmare. And then also you have the GRE, which, you know, some schools nowadays are deciding that, you know, it's actually not a very good measure for intelligence or for being ready for grad school, and other schools still kind of want you to take it. And so my biggest advice is to start early, and that's not necessarily starting early on writing everything and contacting people or doing, you know, a bunch of things. Just kind of start early, as in like try and give yourself a very good timeline of when things are going to be due. Because I think the mistake that I made is not looking into it until well towards, I think it was like the end of the summer. And at that point I was like, oh, I'm going to have to do all of these things. And at the same time, I was in my senior year of college. So it's like, I'm going to have to do all these things while dealing with studying and finals and all of that. And so that can be very stressful. And so it's much better if you have a general idea of what the timeline should be like and kind of break it down into sizable chunks of, you know, maybe at the start of the summer, I'll work on my personal statement outlines. And then at a little bit into the semester, maybe I'll look into, you know, who my references should be and start talking with them. I guess that's the other thing too. Give your references also plenty of time, because they are also very busy. And so the sooner you can get into their heads that, you know, you're going to need them to help you out with this, the better. And it also works out if you can also get them to read your personal statement, if that's kind of the relationship you have with your, you know, with the person giving you your reference letter, because then they can also kind of speak about some of the things you have in your personal statement that you might want to highlight. So that's my advice. Try and start as early as possible, even if starting early means just making a calendar. That is still going to be incredibly helpful.
Just going off what Andrea just said, is for having people read your materials, I think is really valuable, whether it's parents, friends, significant others, partners. They'll probably catch something that you didn't catch because you've reread your document so many times by the time that you're at a complete draft. So having someone else, or my college had a writing center that we could go to, I found very valuable. It's kind of uncomfortable at the same time to have someone read your personal statement possibly, but getting over that initial anxiety hurdle is really valuable. So yeah.
How did you guys approach different types of programs that you would apply to, and how many programs? So I think for me, I applied to maybe 10 or so. I don't know if that was like a really high or low number. I've heard of some people applying to way more and also way less. But I tried to pick some that I thought were kind of stretch programs, not all of which I got into, but I was fortunate to get into MIT, which was my like #1 that I wanted to get into. And then I also had some other programs that I was like a little bit less interested in, but I also thought that I had a higher chance of getting into. And so it actually ended up being a mix of getting into, like it wasn't just like, oh, I got into all the ones that I thought would be easier to get into. They really take into account sort of your fit in the program. So how do your interests coincide with the interests of the research going on at the school? And so it's not always predictable about which schools you'll get into or not. So curious your guys' experience, how many schools you reached out to. Ice?
Yeah, I want to add into that point. I didn't choose a lot of schools mainly because like I was like at a time when I applying to grad school, I was like, if I didn't get in, I would just don't do it. Like if I ever to do PhD, I want to do it at a place that I want to do it, something like that. So I have a very small list, and like for those school, I have to at least 3 or 5 professors that I want to work with. Unless I'm not gonna apply to that program or whatever. And I feel like you ended up spending more time trying to like make your statement like agreeable with that particular program, but you also like ended up having to spend less total time in terms of like how many statements you have to make for each school that you're applying to. So depending on where you are and like how solid your goal is, if you have a very solid goal and like this is a subject or thing that you want to do, I would leaning toward like being more like choose less schools, but like go further into like make it clear like who you want to work with or who you want to rotate with if they have a rotation program, something like that. Yep, Megan.
Yeah, so I think you had a lot of good points, but I disagree with when you said that if you didn't get in, you'd be fine. At this point, when I was a senior in undergrad, I was very like, that was the plan. And I really, if I didn't get in, I don't know what I would have done. I mean, I would have figured it out, but in my head at that moment, I was really trying hard to make sure that that was going to happen for me, because my whole idea was, I wanted to be a professor. How do I become a professor? I get a PhD. So that was kind of just the pipeline for me. So I ended up applying to 6 schools, which seemed like a lot. I think it's, I don't know, it might be around the median, I think, from people I've spoken to. Some people apply to less, some people apply to more. But I also want to echo what Ross mentioned about the pseudo randomness / hard to predict what schools will accept you and what schools won't. It's not analogous to undergrad applications where it's kind of maybe easier to have a so-called reach school or a safe school. When I look at the 6 schools I applied to and I look at the schools that accepted me, it's very hard to find a trend. And I think they really do base it off of where is the research focus and interest, where's the funding. Not every professor is going to have funding that year, and they're not going to accept a ton of students that all want to work for this professor if they're not accepting new students. And you don't necessarily know that at the time. So I just wanted to reiterate Ross's point, because that's something that I like to share to other people, so that they don't feel disheartened or focus too much on trying to predict like what schools they think they'll absolutely get into.
Yeah, definitely focus on where are you most interested in the research. And if you're very interested in the research and can express that in your written statement, then that will go a long ways towards making that school very much in reach for you, even if you think that it's, some crazy institute or something like that. Yeah, especially like if you're interested in synthetic biology and there's a school that has a lot of synthetic biologists, naturally you're going to be inclined to that school, and they might have more positions for people like you and your interests. So something to kind of keep in mind. So related to what you were talking about, Megan, about the urgency of applying. So some people apply right out of undergrad, and some people do gap years first. So I'm kind of curious, your guys' experience, what made you decide whether to take a gap year or not?
Well, I could just start since I kind of just finished, but yeah, so my reason for going to graduate school right after my undergrad was because I wanted to be a professor, and I knew that's what I just needed to do. And having additional industry experience didn't seem like it would put me in a better position at that time for the path that I wanted then. But now being in graduate school, I see a ton of people that do masters, take gap years, do industry, go to other types of post-undergrad learning pursuits. So you get a whole mixed bag. But for me, it was very logical in my head. I was like, how do I be a professor? You get a PhD, So I'm gonna do that right now. So that was my personal plan.
Let me jump in real quick. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, Megan. Like I came from another situation where I was working at the time. So like if they didn't get admitted into a PhD, then I can just apply for the next round, something like that. Because like, you know, I have work, I have jobs. So like, you know, it's pretty different for like undergrads who want to get into, you know, the PhD right away, or like want to get into master right away, and people who are, you know, coming back from the other industry or like the other like post-bac experience, something like that. So you know, that there's no perfect path, but like for each of you, you may find different approaches available, and you can, you know, talk with others who are doing something similar, and that will help the base. Yep, I'm gonna stop it. Neil, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I didn't take a gap, or I went right into my PhD after undergrad, and part of that was because I had done internships throughout my undergrad. So I did a 6-month co-op and a summer internship during my undergrad. And what that made me realize, like looking at the people working there and like what people with different experiences, what roles they had, it made me realize that I wanted to do a PhD, because a lot of the people doing really interesting, cool research all had PhDs, and they like kind of recommended that to me as well. So I had that experience before to kind of lead me toward wanting to just do the PhD right away. But I know a good amount of people in my lab have gone and worked beforehand, and it helped them to some degree, because when you're in the working world, things are more structured than they are in an undergraduate program, at least from my perspective. So they had a little bit more, I'd say, like rigor and things like that right off the bat in the lab, whereas like other people didn't. The tough part on the other end is that like for classwork, they just weren't in the swing of like whatever you have to do studying for exams and things like that. So there's like a push and pull on that aspect. But
And also, I would say something too. So I went, as I said, I had worked for a year. So I guess like if you are maybe no bio, or you know, you're thinking of something way out there, you might want to try and take that year to gain more skills. So I've seen it many different ways, and everybody just talked about this, that some people, you know, did, you know, a co-op, or some people did, you know, a master's, or went and worked. And honestly, if you do that to build skills for a better application, then that's going to help you out. And if you're like not an engineer, and then you maybe want to go into engineering, some look for certain skills, you know, or certain extra coursework, like especially considering engineering, you do a lot of math, and if you have none or something like that. So all of those things can just build up your application. So it's not going to, I have quite the nonlinear path. So like whatever helps build it up and you get more skills, or you feel more confident in what you want to do, or you know what you want to do, will just help you go through that PhD. So it's nothing to look down on if you didn't go straight away, or you're taking time to figure out, because I just wanted to.
Great. So one of you brought up letter writers earlier and giving them lots of time. Who did you guys ask for reference letters, and why?
For me, it was, I asked professors who I was close with, professors whose labs I worked in, even professors who, it's weird, I ended up developing a relationship with a professor, and it just happened right towards the end of my undergrad experience, because I don't know, I feel like they understood me, even though we didn't like talk too much. I feel like they understood me, and I just asked them to review some of my applications, and then from there we started to talk more, and then it was senior design, so we started to just talk more about that, and then we just got to really get to know each other, and then I ended up asking them if they could write a recommendation. Of course, that wasn't plan A or plan B, but it never hurts, because professors could get sick and forget and not write your recommendation letter, or they could just forget, you know, they're human too, right? A lot of things can happen, so it's always good to have more than the bare minimum.
One could think that's a little bit of a deviation, that I guess it's not necessarily who and why I asked them, but it's more of the way I asked them. Is that since I was applying to several different schools, I ended up actually giving my recommendation letter writers a little packet, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but like it worked out really, really well. And so what I did in this packet was first I said, here's a little bit more info about me. So even though some of them kind of knew me throughout my undergrad career, or, you know, maybe knew me very well while I was in their class or whatever, I was still like, okay, that doesn't mean they quite remember everything that I like to do. And so I wrote down, you know, like academic wise or like extracurricular wise, these are the clubs that I'm in, you know, outside of the lab, these are the things I'm passionate about. Like I like drawing, you know, and so like if you want to talk about creativeness, like I'm sure that's going to sound great in a reference letter, that sort of thing. I attached my CV, which was the same, or resume, which were the same that I was going to be putting in my application letters. I attached my personal statement, if that one was also going in my application letters. And then one of the other things I made sure to do was to tell them, you know, if I need you to write, I think I did 3 different ones. If I need you to write 3 different rec letters, this is the school that it's going to, this is the department, and this is kind of what I talk about, or like why I'm interested in that school, just so that if they chose to personalize their own rec letters for those specific schools, it would end up looking a little bit better, or a little bit more like both me and my reference writer actually put the time and effort towards that school, instead of sending a generic like, oh yeah, this student is good, signed, you know, so and so. And so that's another good thing to do, to just kind of like give them a little bit of condensed information as to the things you want to highlight, or you want them to highlight in your reference letters.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the idea of sending a package with additional information to all your letter writers is really, really a good idea. I just wanted to share one kind of weirdish, unconventional thing that I did. Is one of my letter writers, I had 3, one of my letter writers for all my applications was actually a music professor, which is probably, when these people were reading my application, it was probably something they don't get a lot. I did a minor in music performance. So I had one teacher that knew me since I was a freshman, and I had her 8 semesters. So she knew me really well. I met with her several times a week. And so she was able to speak about me as a person, and, you know, I got into schools. So it was effective. And I think, it was kind of a risky move, I thought at the time, like not choosing a STEM professor to write one of my letters, but it ended up working out really well. But it also just emphasized the importance of having to prepare her, because she was in music, I was in engineering. She didn't really know what the application process for graduate schools in engineering was like. So I really needed to tell her all about my research experience, what I'm trying to kind of go into, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, so don't be afraid to extremely value your relationship with your professor, and not so much just like, are they in engineering? Are people going to know who they are? And things like that.
Stina?
And then for me, so a lot of schools require, at least the ones I applied to, required 3 reference letters. So I had 2 of them be research advisors that I had during undergrad. And then the third one, I actually rotated through 3 different professors from my university. So instead of having one professor, I applied to 10 schools, so I also applied to a decent amount. So instead of having one professor put their reference letter into all 10 schools, I actually had one professor put in for 3 and one for 3. I was more comfortable asking, I had my head of department write me a letter. I was more comfortable asking her to submit to 3 schools rather than to all 10, just because of the time commitment that it can take for your reference to put in letters. Can be sometimes time consuming. So that's also an option, is you don't have to put the same 3 references or however many on every application. You can rotate depending what that program may be interested in.
Yeah, just to reiterate on that, not every, or some of your letter writers or potential letter writers might make sense for some programs versus others, especially if, you know, you're interested in different kinds of subfields, and some professors maybe can speak to some aspect of your interests or your goals that would be relevant for one program versus another, you can sort of prioritize in different ways. Some programs also might really value some of your extracurricular things that you've done. And so if you've done outreach and there's a professor that maybe you worked with in that regard, or if you did some of these other minors like music, then yeah, some of them might be more or less valuable depending on the program that you're looking into. And yeah, because it's not 100% about the research, it's also about like you and your sort of overall package, I guess. That makes sense. And a lot of schools have great outreach programs that they do and other non like research in the lab type things. And so they might find it valuable to have somebody that is interested in sort of helping to develop their grad communities or other things that they have going on. Okay, cool. All right, so we're about to get into audience questions. But before we get into that, we'll just ask one round through the panel. Do you have any general tips that we haven't gotten to talk about yet when it comes to getting into research, whether at the undergraduate level or at the graduate level?
At the undergraduate level, I'd say if you're interested, just reach out and do it. At most universities, all it is an email. So yeah, and then at the grad level, I think it helps a lot if you have some experience to know what you like in terms of like undergraduate research. So I definitely, if you're a younger graduate student, try to do that sooner. But try and like, I don't know, read up on different labs and things like that and find what you're passionate about before you go like headfirst into everything. And yeah.
One tip that I will give is that a lot of the times, as you're reaching out to different labs or to different universities, their websites can be very outdated. And so that can kind of throw you for a loop because maybe the papers or, you know, the research interest that they have on the website is something that they were actually working on 5 years ago. And so just my recommendation is to not focus too much on the details of like, you know, oh, they're working on this specific organism with this specific molecule, but to try and get a general idea of, as a lab, what do they do? And if that general idea interests you, then try and pursue that, because you might also go into a lab and your PI or your project might also end up being something that's like, oh, this is completely new grant that we got funding from, this new idea that we're working on, and it's not necessarily related to what you've read up on, but it's still something within the general theme that you're going to be very interested in. So, yeah.
I know this isn't what you asked, but it's something I wish someone would have told me when I was an undergrad and thinking about grad school, is to really enjoy undergrad as much as like we talk about all of these things that are really important to like build your application. Like taking spring break to go with your family or friends is not going to like drastically change your research endeavors. So really take the time in undergrad to build personal relationships and just enjoy time with people and relax, because you have grad school to stress about all of those things. So just enjoy undergrad.
One tip for the undergrad, if you ended up having a chance to get into any in-person outreach or activity, is a lot easier to like, you know, get into some informal relationship with like grad students or other people when you have met, you know, in person once, and then you can follow up in an email. You want to get some discussion, want to chat about like if they have any tips like getting into grad school or something like that. So like, you know, if you go into a conference or like go into some outreach or some activity that your university provided, you know, approaching some students or like having some conversation about something you're interested in could be a good way to hopping into like how the research field is at that time, because it's a lot different from like reading things. Like talking is a lot different.
All right, great guys. All right, so members of the audience, you're welcome to ask us any questions you have. We'll be around for the next 20-25 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up and post some more. I'll post some more resources in here in the meantime. Oh, awesome. I was going to say, if there's not a question right away, I'll ask one from the list, but looks like we already got a biter. Ryan, what's up?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being on this panel. I've learned a lot so far. I had a question about, so I'm an undergrad, and I was wondering what was, or what have been the most surprising things about graduate school compared to like what you, I guess, expected it or thought it would be while you're an undergrad. Yeah.
I guess for me, it's the amount of free travel that you get when you're in grad school. It's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Like, and it just happens based off of saying yes to opportunities, right? I got my school, I'm very involved with Promise and a bunch of other programs. And just by when they ask, hey, Kelsey, you want to participate in this program? Do you want to be on the advisory board? Do you want to do this? And just talking to people at these different conferences and whatnot and sharing your ideas, the things you're passionate about. Literally, for one conversation I had, I'm going to South Africa now in November, and my school is paying for it. And it was just because I was telling them about this idea I had to support graduate students in grad school, right? And that would never happen if I just said yes to an opportunity that seemed like nothing, right? Just by, I think I was sitting at a table just tabling. But yeah, and that happens a lot. Like I've traveled a lot in my grad school now. I'm only in my third year, so that's a cool thing.
I think for me, it's kind of like the hierarchy of being on your own a little bit more compared to college. And so you kind of come from like in high school, you have this very structured schedule, and you also have very structured things you have to do, like homeworks, assignments, exams. And then you get into college and you get a little bit more freedom in the classes you pick, but you still have that same sort of structure of, you have to complete X number of course hours to graduate. And then to graduate within your own program, you have to complete, or you have to, tick off this class, that lab, that sort of thing. But then once you're in grad school, there's the number of requirements or the number of things you have to do gets very, very small. And so as far as coursework, there's a lot less emphasis on coursework and on grades, thankfully, which makes it a lot less stressful. But then that also means that to some degree, you're kind of left on your own on your research, and you kind of have to push yourself to complete the tasks and even push yourself to set tasks for yourself in terms of what experiments you're going to complete or what your goals are, or that sort of thing. And your advisor helps a lot with this, but at the end of the day, you're still kind of like responsible for your own work, or responsible for kind of like your own development and your how far you get each year, each semester. And so that can be a little bit of a strange change, but it's kind of also part of like what you're learning in grad school, how to become an independent scientist.
Exactly what Andrew said I was going to say about the courses. They really don't matter. And some schools have only a few courses, or you choose to take more, or based on your research, or they have a lot, and sometimes a lot is like 10. So compared to your undergrad, that's like nothing. However, the other thing to mention is a lot of people who've never been to grad school, or like your family around you, will be like, you finished your class, aren't you graduating? And you have to explain to them that like PhDs can be, the average PhD in the US is 5.8 years. You're not taking classes 5.8 years, you're taking them maybe a year, 2 years, that is up to you after. So it was kind of crazy for me to think about. And I thought 10 was like a little, but 10 is like a lot. The school that I had to do 10. So it's kind of funny. And the other thing with engineering biology is if someone really doesn't know about that, they're so confused with what with what you're doing and the concept. But part of graduate school is you being able to explain at the level that anybody can understand. So you get to, it's just so crazy with the coursework. It's not about that. It's about how you're becoming an independent scientist and how you can talk and communicate your research. And that's why it can take so long because it's such a big, impactful, novel project. So it's just kind of cool that you get to do your own stuff now. And I thought that was way better than being like, I have to complete 130 credits of classes. You know, you're thinking, but you're not like going through that, like your whole process. So it's very cool and creative.
Awesome. Question from Justin.
Yeah, I was wondering, did any of you guys, or have you met anyone or have any experience with applying for grad schools that are outside of the States, or what any of that may look like? Is it something where it's very common, Kelsey, you mentioned earlier, with a lot of travel and master's programs. So is it very common that you may apply and go to a master's or PhD program somewhere, but then you end up spending a lot of time at a different institution in a different country? Or I just have interests of being out of states or trying to, and I'm wondering whether or not education how well it commingles and coexists with that goal.
Since I'm an international student, I will say quick things about, different PhD track in other countries. So when I apply to the PhD program, I apply to both like in the US and in the Europe. And there's a big difference in Europe where like they do master first, then they do relatively shorter PhD, and PhD for them, there's no class at all. So it usually like takes, it can be done in 3 or 4 years if you're, ready to do things. So I would say, since they're different, if you want to, shoot for some programs in like some overseas program, check with their program first whether like they require a master or not, because that's pretty common for some program in Europe to require a master, since the program is different. But yeah, so I think that's what I've seen so far about PhD program outside of the US.
I think another thing I've noticed that's different is a lot of, like, I'm up in Canada now, and I've noticed this a lot here. A lot of students actually apply more directly to individual labs as opposed to first applying to a program and doing rotations. So there's, for like the biomedical engineering program here at UBC, there's like you can come in and do rotations, but it seems like most students actually come in directly. And for a lot of the other programs here, that's the case. And my impression for some of the European labs is that it's also very much more direct interactions between you and potential future labs. So we had a student here that was applying to a lab at somewhere in the UK, and yeah, they were directly communicating with the professors that they were interested in there, and they were talking about potential funding for their position and stuff with the lab. Whereas for a lot of US institutions, you more so will apply to the program and then will find your way into a lab through rotations. But there are certainly schools like Duke where it's more of the direct admit model. And so, yeah, I think that can be an interesting slight cultural difference between the schools, and then also just the different lengths of PhD programs and expectations that Ice mentioned.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Ryan?
Yeah, I had another question about, there's one of the comments in the chat said sometimes like you're selected or not selected because the lab may or may not have space, or there might be limited space in the program, stuff like that. Or like, for example, professors not taking grad students. Is it appropriate to like reach out beforehand to professors you're interested in and or programs you're interested in to see if there's like space in that particular program? And then also, is it, I guess, like, I don't know how well you guys would know this, but is it worth mentioning particular labs in your applications, or does that in some sense like close off the opportunities with other labs?
Yes and yes. So it's definitely, it's probably a good idea, absolutely, to check with labs you're interested in to see if they're taking students. So you can say, you can just ask that, like, hey, I'm interested in your work. Are you taking students next year or in the coming years? And if yeah, then they can connect you with students in their lab, maybe to chat more, or maybe you can talk with the professor directly. If they're not, they might be able to point you to other labs at their school or at other schools that might be doing similar stuff. So you can ask for recommendations. When it comes to, shoot, now I'm forgetting the second part of your question, but definitely the answer to that was also yes.
One
As
thing
far-
that I want to thank you guys. One thing that I want to add to that is I guess the second part of your question is it good to mention it in your applications or mention it even to professors and ask them? I would say it definitely is, especially before you apply to schools, because then also sometimes the people you reach out to, like the advisor, your potential advisors, they might also be within the admissions committee. And so it's good to have them be like, oh, hey, I recognize that person. I've been speaking to them. Like, you know, and they might take a closer look at your application because they know that you are eager to be there. But the only thing I would warn against, at least in applications or mentioning specific labs, is to not do it in a very closed way, or like try to not phrase it as, oh, I only want to get in these specific labs, and if those labs don't have space, like I'm not interested in the school. Phrase it more as like the research these labs do is what interested me. But of course I'm welcome to like try and see, you know, like and so now I'm interested in the university as a whole, or that sort of thing, because then you might also run into the problem where they say, oh, well, we actually don't think that, you know, those 3 labs have any space, and so we don't want to admit you and then have you not find a place for you. And so just make sure that when you phrase that, you phrase it in an open-ended way and not close any doors by accident.
In my experience, I actually said that I want to be in this specific lab when I applied to the school I'm at now. And I ended up being in a totally different lab because that professor was leaving for some other reasons. And, you know, I thought, okay, that's the end of that. But I was just receptive and open to what the possibilities were. And another professor from that same school called me, and we spoke almost every single day when I was a senior in grad school. And then we developed such a close relationship that that's how I ended up in his lab, even though what he does was nothing remotely on my radar, right? And then he ended up giving me a project. So I had a project coming into grad school, and those are like the best kinds of situations where, you know, the professor's trying to build something new, especially with, I feel like engineering biology, they're trying to build something new. So you get to kind of drive the boat and, you know, figure everything out on your own and build that program in that lab. And yeah, so yeah, be very intentional where you want to be, but also be receptive if that door is closed to other opportunities that may arise.
Yeah, I would generally just add on from the perspective of the reviewers looking at your application, demonstrating or like articulating your interest in some of the specific labs is sort of good evidence for why you would be a particularly good fit for the program overall. And so you can, as the other panelists have mentioned, sort of use the labs as an example for why you're interested in the school, to sort of highlight the ones that you're most interested in. But I can also tell you that like when I ended up going to grad school, I don't even know if I rotated in most of the labs that I mentioned, because by the time that I got there a year later or whatever, it was, you know, I had already sort of advanced and changed my mind and so on. So they kind of know that you're not necessarily like laser focused on going into those labs, or maybe you are, but you can write it in that way to be ambiguous about it, but still give the concrete example so that they see that, yes, you clearly have like good like rationale for wanting to be in their program, basically. More questions? Brian.
Did you go on me? Sorry. Okay, I'll just ask. So how, I suppose, like when looking at literature and experiments that I find interesting, I think I'm worried that like kind of listing most of like the popular labs because they tend to have more publications and tend to have more popular research. So a couple questions. First, like, what are your thoughts with regards to like finding and or doing research on labs that are like smaller, for example, and then also how would I go about thinking about like the culture of the lab without having the opportunity to actually be there, as I'm thinking about graduate schools.
If there's not like anything on the website that you can gather about like these smaller labs, you could just reach out to the PI and see, I don't know, what they're working on at that point, if you're curious about that. But I would say like smaller labs probably have a smaller focus as well. So what their papers are about are probably more focused on what their actual work is. So I don't think the number of publications necessarily gives you a better view on like what a lab works on necessarily.
I think another important thing to look at is how established versus new the professor is. And so new professors usually have small but growing labs, and you might not even really see much about them. They probably haven't published too much as a lab. They may have just started in the last year or two, but those can often be great labs to get into because you sort of help to build the lab itself, and train people that come in. And I've generally seen that people have had a good time in those labs. But if you want to hit the ground running more, or you want to be able to explore even within one lab, different kinds of research areas, then you might want to go for an established bigger lab that already has a lot of funding and can kind of move into more different areas. Because a new and a smaller lab, which is typically also new, like they probably can't divert too much from what they're trying to do. Like the loop of a new professor is get some students in, start on some projects, get preliminary data so that they could get grants. And you need to get those grants going so that you can get the projects going. In an established lab, you might have some more time to explore a new topic, especially if you've got a fellowship, which is helpful in any situation, but especially in a bigger lab, you can open up a new line of research, and eventually maybe you can work on a grant application with your PI, but it wouldn't be as urgent. And so you'll probably have a little bit more freedom to explore in that situation. So think about whether you want to build something from scratch, and if you have a really good alignment of your research goals with the professors, then maybe a smaller lab or a new lab is sort of a good fit for you. Or if you want to have room to explore, maybe a bigger lab is a good fit beyond just their specific research topics. Okay, I see a question from Nathan, and sorry if I missed earlier ones in the chat. Did you choose your PhD project or lab with a specific postgrad job in mind that this project or lab would help you get into?
My quick answer is no. So I ended up in my lab at Georgia Tech. We don't do rotations or anything, but first year graduate students get a month to figure out whose lab they want to be in. I kind of joke and say it's like speed dating, because you meet with a ton of professors, you go to all their group meetings, you meet with current graduate students. So like right now we're in the speed dating month. So I'm meeting with all the new first years, and last week at our group meeting, we had like 16 first years that were just sitting in, seeing what we're doing. So I did that as a first year, and I chose my lab based off of how well I thought I got along with the PI. That was super important to me, making sure I can be myself with someone for 5 years, and that they were easy to talk to, and we had very similar ways of communication, and just like motivations, I guess, and philosophy of science and graduate school in general. How well I thought I would get along with the other graduate students in the lab was also super important. And then obviously just like the science. But I can't stress enough, like I ended up in my lab just because, I hate to say it, but it was like a gut instinct and a vibe that I got, and it just felt right and made sense. But But yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, like my post grad school endeavors were academia based. So I didn't really see, I wasn't really choosing projects with that in mind. I figured any project I could have done would help me get where I needed to go. So it was just based off interest and vibes, for lack of a better term.
I will also go with no, and part of the reason for that is because also at least for most jobs, it doesn't really matter what your project is on. It's a little bit more of kind of what skills you learned, and the big sort of skill is like how well you are at critical thinking as a scientist, or like how you approach things. Like that's kind of the overall goal of the PhD. But then there's also individual skills, like say you learn how to do qPCR, or you learn how to do tissue culture, or maybe you're very good at protein engineering. That kind of tends to be more of the sorts of things that matter for you to carry on, and not necessarily what specific proteins you worked with or what specific gene you studied. But then a lot of the times, even then, there's a lot of job opportunities where you can come in and say, you know, like me, for example, I work with bacteria. I could still go and find a job working with mammalian cells, which is something that I've never done. And there's still a lot of opportunities just because I can present myself as a person who knows how to go about the scientific process, and that to them is the valuable part. But then also, if it's still a bit too much of a bridge to gap in between these two, what a lot of people do is from their PhD, they go and do a postdoc that is in something completely different from what they did their PhD in, or maybe a little bit more specific to what they now realize is what they want to do. And then in the postdoc is where you kind of start to focus more on, you know, these are the kinds of skills I want to develop because this is the kind of job that I'm interested in. And so you don't necessarily have to go into a lab thinking that far ahead, because the opportunities are still very open.
Yeah, I think I'll just tack on to that a lot of people go into grad school with a strong idea of what they want to do afterwards. And certainly you can write that into your application and they're not going to hold you to it. And then they change their mind completely. They go in wanting to be a professor and they come out wanting to go work in policy or something like that. And so it's totally okay. It's a great time to explore different interests. You can try to set yourself up for the future skill-wise, but be open to the many, many opportunities that grad school and a PhD will bring to you. All right. Are there any final thoughts, guys, that you'd like to say for our participants? Oh, Taha, question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, do you guys think it's a good idea to like do a part-time PhD while working in the industry, or is it better to allocate all of your time and energy to finishing your PhD and then starting your, I don't know, your career or whatever?
If I heard correctly, you asked about like whether it's a good idea to do something related to industry while doing PhD, right? Like something like internship during your PhD, something like that?
I meant like more like starting a full-time job in the industry and doing like a part-time PhD.
Oh. Yeah, I'm not sure how many programs will provide a part-time PhD in the US. But I would say so far in my past years doing a PhD, it's pretty hard to focus in your PhD if you're working on something else together with it. Like it requires decent amount of commitment. So and it depends on like how long you want to do on your PhD as well. So I would rather like be committed and focus on the PhD. But like, others have different situation.
It's funny, right? 'Cause I just had this same conversation with a mentor at my school, just talking about this. And basically, if you want to make more money, apply to more fellowships, right? Not everyone has the privilege of being able to live off a stipend. So, if you just communicate with your department, like, hey, I have kids. Hey, I have a spouse. Hey, that's not able to work. Hey, I got this, that, I got whatever. I have responsibilities that require an excess and that requires more than what your stipend's paying me. Yeah, apply to more fellowships. So like have a list of fellowships, game plan with your PI or your advisor, your mentor to help win those as many as possible. That's one option. The other option is communicate with them. And then they'll either say, sure, you can pick a part-time job somewhere, or no, or you can get a side gig, which I would recommend. But I mean, so it's a slippery slope, right? I've seen some PhD students start their own consulting gigs. You know, that can easily take off and you kind of abandon your PhD, or, you know, it can consume all your time. It can go either way. So just my recommendation, try applying as many fellowships as you can, A, and B, communicate with your department. Be honest with them.
A quick thing to add to that is that some programs just straight up don't let you work, even if it's part-time while you are studying. And so if you're in a situation where you really need to still have another side job or another kind of thing going on while you study, then you should try to make sure from the get-go that this is a possibility, just so you don't get into any kind of trouble with them.
Justin.
Does any of this information or advice really change if you're in a pre-med pathway?
I want to add to that or answer that because I was actually pre-med up until maybe my last year. And so Justin, if you want to message me, I'm not sure if you're on the Slack, or I was also about to, or well, I guess I have my email on there. We can chat a little bit more, but for the most part, the pre-med track and the grad school track are very similar. I would say the pre-med track is a little bit more hardcore, a little bit more insane and strict than grad school, which is kind of a relief. But yeah, I mean, you're probably on the right track. But if you want to ask a bit more specific, feel free to contact me and we can chat at a later date.
For sure, I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for all the advice.
All right, thanks everyone for coming again. I don't know if anybody has some final words, but if not, thanks again for coming. We'll have more things in the future. Please fill out the feedback form that I posted earlier in the chat. And if you didn't sign up for our Slack, there's a link there where you can do so, and you can ask us more questions on there. We'll be monitoring it relatively frequently. We'll see. Cool. All right, and thanks to the panelists. I should also say thanks to them too. Cool. All right, we'll shut it down. Thanks again.
See you there, guys.